"Little girl, these medals aren't trinkets you find in a cereal box. Your mother doesn't have them." The words, slick with condescension and cheap whiskey, cut through the polite murmur of the officers' club dining hall. The crowd at Major Thorne's table, a collection of junior officers and sycophantic aides, chuckled nervously. They laughed because he was a major on the fast track to promotion, a man whose opinion could shape a career, and because his arrogance was a force of nature they had learned to orbit rather than resist. He was holding court, his dress uniform a canvas of achievement, the ribbons and medals on his chest a vibrant testament to a career he never tired of recounting. His voice was a booming instrument of self-regard, each anecdote polished to a high gloss, each achievement magnified in the telling. The target of his derision, a young waitress named Alara, did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, a silver water pitcher in her hand, her posture impossibly straight. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun, remained a placid mask of professional neutrality. She simply held her position, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the major's shoulder, waiting for the conversational storm to pass so she could continue her duties. But Major Thorne wasn't finished. He reveled in an audience. He saw her silence not as dignity, but as a vacuum he was obligated to fill with the sound of his own importance. He gestured expansively at his own chest. "You see this one?" he asked, tapping a lustrous silver star. "This is for valor, for running into the fire when everyone else is running out. It means you made a choice between your life and the lives of your men. You don't get one of these for serving brunch." More sycophantic laughter, this time a little louder, a little more confident. Alara's gaze remained unwavering. There was no anger in her eyes, no flicker of shame or defiance. There was only a profound and unnerving calm, a stillness that seemed to absorb the noise around her, rendering it impotent. But a few tables away, seated in a quiet corner, General Vance saw it. He saw not the plain black and white uniform of a club waitress, but the stance. It was a subtle thing, easy to miss. The way her feet were planted, shoulder-width apart. The way her shoulders were squared, not with tension, but with a deep, ingrained discipline. It was the posture of a soldier at parade rest, an unconscious habit that years of civilian life had failed to erase. And in that moment, the general knew the major was making a catastrophic mistake. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the steadiness of the hand, type quiet professional below. The entire incident had begun with an innocent observation, a whisper of a comment from Alara that was never intended for public consumption. She had been refilling Major Thorne's water glass, her movements economical and silent, a ghost at the edge of his grand performance. He had been pontificating on the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for valor, detailing with cinematic flair the firefight in which he'd earned it. He spoke of chaos, of shouting, of the visceral fear that he, and only he, had managed to conquer. As he paused for dramatic effect, Alara, her eyes briefly glancing at the intricate metal, had murmured, almost to herself, "It's beautiful. My mom has one just like it." The comment was soft, a simple statement of fact laced with a quiet pride. But Thorne, whose ears were finely tuned to any sound that might relate to him, heard it as a challenge, an absurd and insulting comparison. He had twisted in his seat, his smile turning into a sneer, and unleashed his verbal barrage. Now, the room was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with military readiness. It was the heavy, awkward silence of social contract being publicly violated. Officers at other tables pretended to be engrossed in their conversations, their gazes fixed on their plates, but their attention was entirely focused on the drama unfolding at the major's table. They felt a collective cringe, a second-hand embarrassment for the girl, and a weary disdain for Thorne, whose ego was a known and tolerated liability. Alara, however, seemed to exist outside this field of social pressure. While the major continued his tirade, her attention was on the task at hand. She noted that a captain's wine glass was nearly empty, that the bread basket needed refilling, that a streak of condensation was forming on the polished wood of the table. Her world was one of precise, observable details, a world where actions had clear and immediate consequences. A spilled drink needed to be cleaned. An empty glass needed to be filled. An arrogant man's words, however, were just noise. They required no action, and so she gave them none. She waited, the heavy silver pitcher growing neither heavier nor lighter in her steady grip. Her breathing remained slow and even, a silent metronome counting down the seconds until she could return to the silent, orderly choreography of her work. This absolute lack of reaction was, to Thorne, the most infuriating response of all. He expected fear, or tears, or a flustered apology. Her placid composure was a mirror, and in it his boorishness was reflected back at him, magnified. He was a man accustomed to deference, and her simple, professional dignity felt like an act of defiance. He mistook her discipline for insolence. He saw her calm as a challenge to his authority, and so he doubled down, his voice rising, determined to crack the serene facade and force the reaction he felt he was owed. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to prove that his rank, his medals, his voice were the most powerful things in this room. He was about to learn that the most powerful things are often the most silent, the most overlooked, and the most profoundly misunderstood. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to a contest of wills that was far more complex than a simple confrontation between a major and a waitress. It was a clash of two opposing philosophies, one of loud, declared importance, and another of quiet, demonstrated worth. And in the hushed, opulent dining hall of the Fort Gower Officers Club, a lesson was about to be taught, not in a classroom or on a training field, but over a half-eaten steak and a glass of whiskey. The lesson was as old as the profession of arms itself. Assumptions are a commander's greatest enemy, and true respect is a fortress that can never be taken by force. It can only be surrendered willingly to proven competence. The crisis, when it came, was not heralded by the blast of a klaxon or the crackle of a radio. It began with a cough, a small, dry, choked sound from the corner table where General Vance sat with two visiting colonels. At first, no one paid any mind. It was a minor disruption, a footnote in the grander drama of Major Thorne's public spectacle. But the cough was followed by another, this one sharper, more violent. A piece of steak, the very same cut that Major Thorne was enjoying, had become lodged in the general's airway. His face, normally a mask of serene authority, began to turn a dusky red. His eyes widened in a silent, primal panic. One of the colonels, a man with a chest full of his own ribbons, slapped the general's back, a well-intentioned but useless gesture. The second colonel fumbled to his feet, shouting for a medic, his voice tight with alarm. The polite murmur of the dining hall dissolved into a cacophony of scraping chairs and panicked shouts. The carefully constructed order of the evening shattered. Major Thorne, his diatribe against Illyria instantly forgotten, swiveled in his seat. He saw the commotion, the unmistakable signs of a medical emergency. He was a decorated combat leader, a man who prided himself on his decisiveness under pressure. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Give him room. Someone call 911, he boomed, his voice taking on the timbre of command. He started moving toward the table, but his movements were clumsy, uncertain. He was an officer, a strategist, a leader of men in battle, but this was a different kind of enemy. This was a silent, internal foe, and his training, his experience, his medals offered no clear protocol. He was just another bystander, his authority rendered meaningless by a crisis he did not know how to solve. While the room descended into chaos, Illyria moved. She did not run. She did not shout. Her motion was a study in controlled urgency. She placed the silver water pitcher on a nearby service stand with a quiet, deliberate click. Her face was no longer placidly neutral. It was now a mask of intense, focused concentration. Her eyes, which had been so distant moments before, were now locked on the struggling general, assessing, analyzing, processing. She moved through the maze of overturned chairs and panicked officers with a fluid, economical grace, as if she were the only person in the room who knew the shortest distance between 2 points. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce her intentions. She simply acted. As she reached the table, the first colonel was still trying to perform a clumsy Heimlich maneuver, his arms wrapped awkwardly around the much larger general. It wasn't working. The general's struggles were weakening, his face darkening to a frightening shade of purple. "Let me," Alara said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of absolute, unshakable authority that cut through the noise. It was the voice of a professional taking command of a scene. The colonel, startled, loosened his grip, and in that instant, Alara was in position. Her preparation was a blur of practiced motions, a symphony of competence. Her left hand found the space just above the general's navel. Her right hand formed a fist, the thumb tucked in, and she placed it precisely against his abdomen. Her stance shifted, her center of gravity lowered. It was the textbook form of a lifesaver, but executed with a degree of speed and precision that spoke of countless hours of training, of muscle memory forged in the crucible of high-stress repetition. She was no longer a waitress. In that moment, she was a technician, a medic, an instrument of intervention. The scene was a tableau of stark contrasts. The opulent dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany, became an impromptu emergency room. The decorated officers, men trained to lead in the chaos of war, were now a helpless audience. And at the center of it all was the quiet, unassuming waitress, her hands, which had only moments ago been serving wine, now holding the life of a 4-star general. Major Thorne stood frozen a few feet away, his mouth agape. He was watching something that his mind could not process. He was watching the little girl he had just ridiculed perform with a level of calm confidence that he, for all his battlefield experience, could not currently muster. He was witnessing the silent, irrefutable power of demonstrated skill, and it was rendering his entire worldview obsolete. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, not of social awkwardness, but of life and death. The only sounds were the general's labored, failing gasps and the steady, rhythmic sound of Alara's own calm breathing, an anchor of professional composure in a sea of escalating panic. The entire room seemed to lean in, a silent, collective prayer hanging in the balance, waiting for the outcome of this improbable, shocking, and utterly compelling demonstration. The first thrust was sharp, powerful, and perfectly placed. Alara's body moved as a single, coordinated unit, channeling force from her legs up through her core and into her arms. It was a movement of pure, kinetic efficiency. The general's large frame jolted forward. A collective gasp swept through the room. The second thrust was just as precise, just as powerful. Alara's expression remained unchanged, her brow furrowed in concentration, her eyes fixed on the general's face, watching for any sign of change. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Her actions were as clean and methodical as a surgeon's incision. It was on the third inward and upward thrust that it happened. The obstruction, a significant piece of gristle-laden beef, dislodged. It shot from the general's mouth, landing with a soft, wet thud on the pristine white tablecloth. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. A deep, ragged, whooping gasp for air filled the room as the general's lungs, starved for oxygen, finally drew a breath. The sound was raw, desperate, and the most beautiful thing anyone in that room had ever heard. It was the sound of a life pulled back from the brink. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, more profound than the polite murmur it had replaced. Every eye was fixed on the scene. They saw the general, leaning heavily on the table, his chest heaving, the color slowly returning to his face. And they saw Alara, her hands still in position, holding him steady, her expression now softening from intense concentration to watchful concern. She hadn't celebrated. She hadn't recoiled. She had simply transitioned to the next phase of her protocol, a phase that existed only in her mind, post-intervention assessment. She gently lowered the general into his chair, her hands guiding him with a strength that seemed impossible for her slender frame. The other officers, who had been frozen in a state of panicked paralysis, now rushed forward, a babble of voices erupting at once. "Are you all right, sir? Get him some water. The medics are on their way." But General Vance raised a hand, a gesture of command that was still weak but undeniably clear. The babble ceased immediately. He took another deep, shuddering breath, then another. He looked down at the offending piece of meat on the tablecloth. Then he looked up at Alara. His eyes, clear and sharp despite the ordeal, held a look of dawning comprehension, of profound and astonished respect. He saw past the waitress uniform. He saw the ingrained competence, the unshakable calm under extreme pressure. He saw a fellow professional, and he recognized her with a clarity that transcended rank and circumstance. Major Thorne was still standing a few feet away, a statue of disbelief. The sneer had been wiped from his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. The world, as he understood it, had just been turned upside down. The hierarchy of competence he had so carefully constructed in his mind, with himself at the apex, had been shattered. He had boasted of valor in the face of chaos. Yet when a real, immediate crisis had erupted, he had been reduced to a shouting, ineffective bystander. The little girl, the object of his scorn, had acted. She had moved with a purpose and skill that was not just admirable. It was breathtaking. It was the kind of performance he had always imagined for himself, but had failed to deliver. The irony was a physical weight pressing down on him, stealing the air from his own lungs. His medals felt suddenly heavy on his chest, not like badges of honor, but like gaudy, meaningless decorations. He had talked the talk, but she had walked the walk, and the entire officers' club had been there to witness it. The contrast between his loud boasts and her silent, decisive action was a verdict delivered without a single word. His public humiliation was complete, not because anyone had shamed him, but because his own inadequacy had been so starkly exposed by her effortless competence. The room remained hushed, the atmosphere charged with the aftershock of the event. The diners were no longer just diners. They were witnesses. They had seen something extraordinary, a moment of true grace under pressure that would be recounted for years to come. They had watched a hierarchy be inverted, not by an order or a promotion, but by a single, undeniable act of skill. The waitress had saved the general. The quiet professional had silenced the loudmouth. The lesson was stark, simple, and unforgettable, and the final, official validation was about to begin. General Vance, taking another steadying breath, waved off the frantic staff who were now converging on him with offers of water and medical assistance. "I'm fine," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "I'm perfectly fine." He slowly pushed himself to a more upright position in his chair, his gaze never leaving Alara. He ignored the fawning colonels and the stunned onlookers. In that moment, there were only two people in the room who mattered, the rescuer and the rescued. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the faint sheen of perspiration on her forehead, the only sign of the immense physical and mental effort she had just expended. He saw the methodical way she was already scanning the area, her eyes checking for secondary hazards, a habit so deeply ingrained it was reflexive. "What's your name, young lady?" the general asked, his voice regaining its customary resonance. "Alara, sir," she replied, her tone respectful but matter-of-fact. The "sir" was automatic, a ghost of a past life slipping through the cracks of her civilian persona. It was another small clue, another piece of the puzzle that was clicking into place for the general. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He wasn't just making conversation. He was running a diagnostic, cross-referencing what he had seen with a vast mental database of military training and special operations protocols. The way she had assessed the victim, the precise placement of her hands, the controlled application of force. It wasn't just a textbook Heimlich. There was a subtle efficiency to it, a refinement he had seen before, but only in the most elite of medical operators. He decided to test his hypothesis. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational level, yet it carried across the silent room with an undeniable weight of authority. "The Nightingale Protocol," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Section 3. What's the follow-up for a compromised airway after a cleared physical obstruction? The question was a key designed to fit a very specific lock. It was esoteric, technical jargon, a piece of knowledge utterly foreign to a civilian, and even to most standard military personnel. It was a shibboleth, a password that would identify her as a member of a very exclusive tribe. A flicker of surprise crossed Alara's face, the first genuine emotion she had displayed all evening. It was the shock of recognition, of being seen for who she truly was by someone who spoke her language. She straightened up, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly back into that familiar parade rest. "Stabilize C-spine, if there was a fall," she answered, her voice clear and precise, the words flowing with the ease of long-memorized doctrine. "Monitor vitals, especially SpO2. Prepare for immediate case vac to a level 2 facility and have a suction and intubation kit on standby in case of laryngeal spasm or secondary swelling." Sir, the answer was perfect. It was textbook, concise, and delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who hadn't just read it in a manual, but had likely lived it. The final "sir" was the confirmation. It wasn't deference to his rank in the dining hall. It was the ingrained respect of a subordinate to a superior officer, a reflex she couldn't suppress. A slow smile spread across General Vance's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. He had found a unicorn in the wild. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the room until it landed, with deliberate and crushing weight, on Major Thorne. The Major, who had been trying to shrink into the background, found himself pinned by the general's stare. "Major," Vance began, his voice deceptively soft, "earlier this evening, you were holding a seminar on the nature of valor, on the meaning of the decorations we wear on our chests." Thorne's face went pale. He could see where this was going, and it was a destination of pure mortification. "You made some assumptions about this young lady, about her family, about her mother." The general paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and sharp. He then turned his attention back to Alara, his voice softening again. "Alara," he said gently, "you mentioned your mother. What was her unit?" Alara hesitated for a fraction of a second, a lifetime of ingrained operational security warring with the direct question from a 4-star general. Then she answered, her voice quiet but firm. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, sir. The Night Stalkers." A murmur went through the room. The Night Stalkers. The name itself was legend. The elite helicopter pilots and crews who flew special operations forces into the darkest corners of the world. And her role? Vance pressed, already knowing the answer. She was a flight medic, Alara said. A 68 Whiskey with advanced certification, General Vance nodded, a deep, slow, knowing nod. The puzzle was complete. "Major Thorne," he said, his voice now like chips of ice. "The Distinguished Service Cross you were so proud of? A Night Stalker flight medic earns that for performing life-saving surgery in the back of a Black Hawk, under enemy fire, flying at treetop level, in complete darkness, with nothing but the light on her helmet and the skill in her hands. The Silver Star? That's for crawling out of a crashed helicopter, wounded, and setting up a casualty collection point while returning fire." He pointed a finger at Alara. "This young lady didn't just learn what to do from a book. She learned it at her mother's knee. That kind of competence, that grace under pressure isn't taught. It's inherited. It's a legacy." He stood up, slowly, majestically. He faced Alara, and in a gesture that stunned the entire room into an even deeper silence, he drew himself to attention and rendered a slow, perfect, formal salute. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. Then he added, "And please pass on my deepest respects to your mother." The validation was absolute. The rebuke was devastating. The lesson was complete. The salute was a thunderclap in the silent room. A 4-star general, a living legend within the armed forces, saluting a waitress. It was a gesture that shattered every established protocol of rank and station. It wasn't a salute from a general to a civilian. It was a salute from one warrior to another, a profound acknowledgement of shared values and proven worth. The sight of it, the old general, his back ramrod straight, his hand cutting a sharp line to his brow, and the young woman, standing in her simple black and white uniform, receiving the highest form of military respect, was seared into the memory of everyone present. Alara, caught off guard by the gesture, reacted on pure instinct. Her body snapped to attention, her hands falling to her sides, her chin up. She couldn't salute back. She was a civilian, but she could stand and receive the honor with the dignity it deserved. For a moment, they stood like that, a tableau of mutual respect that transcended the ornate trappings of the officers' club. Then, the general dropped his salute and offered a small, almost paternal smile. The spell was broken. The room exhaled as one. The base medics finally arrived, pushing a gurney through the parted crowd, their expressions a mixture of urgency and confusion. General Vance waved them away with a calm finality. "Not necessary," he said. The situation was handled. By a professional, his eyes flicked again toward Major Thorne, ensuring the final word landed with the force of a hammer blow. Thorne looked as if he had been physically struck. All the color had drained from his face, leaving a pasty, gray pallor. His arrogance, the loud, brittle armor he wore every day, had been stripped from him, leaving him exposed and diminished. He stood amidst the wreckage of his own hubris, the object of pity and scorn from the very junior officers he had sought to impress. He couldn't meet the general's eyes. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He stared at the floor, at his own polished shoes, as if they held the answers to how his evening, his reputation, had so spectacularly imploded. The story began to spread before the dessert course was even served. It moved in whispers, in furtive glances, in urgent text messages sent from beneath tablecloths. The legend of the waitress who saved the general was born. It was a perfect story, a modern military fable with a clear hero, a clear villain, and a powerful moral. It had all the elements: the underdog, the arrogant superior, the sudden crisis, the shocking display of skill, and the dramatic, public vindication. By the time the dining hall was being cleared for the night, the narrative was already taking shape, its details being polished and refined with each retelling. The base, like any closed community, was a powerful echo chamber. News, especially news this scandalous and inspiring, traveled faster than a command directive. It leaped from the officers' club to the enlisted barracks, from the flight line to the motor pool, from the command headquarters to the chow hall. It became the topic of conversation over morning coffee, during weapons cleaning, and in the quiet hours of guard duty. The story was a wildfire, and Major Thorne's reputation was the kindling. He became a cautionary tale overnight, a living symbol of the dangers of assumption and the folly of judging a book by its cover. His name became a punchline, his story a lesson taught to new lieutenants by grizzled sergeants. Don't be a Thorne. Meanwhile, Alara became something else entirely. She was no longer just the quiet waitress. She was a figure of quiet renown, a local celebrity shrouded in an aura of mystery and respect. The kitchen staff, who had always known her as a diligent and silent worker, now looked at her with a new sense of awe. The officers who frequented the club, many of whom had been present for the incident, now treated her with a deference usually reserved for a command sergeant major. They made eye contact. They said please and thank you. Some of the younger ones, emboldened by respect rather than alcohol, would quietly ask her about her mother, about the Night Stalkers, their questions tinged with a genuine, hero-worshipping curiosity. Alara handled the newfound attention with the same unflappable grace she had handled the crisis. She answered questions politely but briefly, never embellishing, never boasting. She deflected praise, insisting she had only done what anyone with her training would have done. Her humility only served to amplify her legend. She remained a quiet professional, her competence a silent, powerful force that needed no announcement. She continued to fill water glasses, to clear plates, to move through the dining hall like a ghost, but now everyone saw her. They saw not a servant, but a guardian in disguise, a reminder that the greatest strengths are often hidden in the plainest of packages. The incident had fundamentally altered the social ecosystem of the base, a small, powerful lesson in humility that would ripple outwards for years to come. The days following the incident settled into a new kind of normal. The initial buzz of gossip began to subside, replaced by a deeper, more permanent shift in the base's culture. Major Thorne, once a constant, booming presence in the officers' club, was conspicuously absent. He was, as the rumors had it, on a short, command-suggested leave. When he returned, he was a changed man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost haunted demeanor. He kept to himself. His voice, when he spoke, was softer, more measured. The arrogance had been sandblasted away, leaving behind the raw, humbled core of a man who had been forced to confront his own profound ignorance in the most public way imaginable. His transformation culminated one evening about a week after his return. Alara was finishing her shift, wiping down the last of the tables in the now empty dining hall. The silence of the room was broken by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Major Thorne standing in the doorway, his uniform immaculate, but his face etched with an unfamiliar uncertainty. He looked like a man about to face a firing squad. He walked slowly toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Miss," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "My name is—" "It's Major Thorne." He stumbled over his own name, as if it tasted like ash in his mouth. "I know," Alara said, her voice neutral, neither warm nor cold. She stopped wiping the table and gave him her full attention. Thorne took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before diving into icy water. "What I said to you, what I did, there is no excuse for it. It was arrogant, it was ignorant, and it was cruel. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong." He was not looking at her, but at a point on the floor between them. "I disrespected you, and I disrespected the memory and the service of your mother. I can't imagine she raised a daughter with your kind of courage and skill by being anything less than a hero herself. The medals I wear, I forgot what they truly mean. They mean sacrifice. They mean humility. You and your mother. You reminded me of that." He finally lifted his head, and for the first time, Alara saw not arrogance in his eyes, but a deep, painful shame. "I am truly, profoundly sorry," he said. Alara listened to his confession without interruption. She saw the sincerity in his apology. She saw the genuine remorse of a man who had been shattered and was now trying to piece himself back together into something better. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I accept your apology, Major," she said. It was a simple statement, but for Thorne, it was a lifeline. "Thank you," he whispered, a wave of relief washing over his face. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but he seemed to understand that his presence was an intrusion. He gave a short, awkward nod, turned, and walked out of the dining hall, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He had learned his lesson. He had faced his own failure and taken the first, most difficult step toward redemption. Alara watched him go, then calmly returned to her work. She held no grudge. In her world, you assessed a situation, you acted, and you moved on. The incident was closed. Her own life, however, was about to change. A few days later, a package arrived for her at the club. It was a small, heavy box with the official seal of the Department of the Army. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, was a command coin. It was a heavy piece of polished brass, and on one side was the crest of General Vance's old command, the 75th Ranger Regiment. On the other side, an inscription, "To Alara, for demonstrating a standard to which we all aspire." SUA, spont below the Latin phrase. Of their own accord, the Ranger motto was the general's signature. Tucked alongside the coin was a handwritten note. It was brief and to the point. "Your mother raised you well. If you ever decide you want to wear a uniform again, my door is always open. The Army needs more quiet professionals like you." Vance Alara held the coin in her palm, its weight a solid, tangible thing. It was more than a thank you. It was an invitation, a validation, a signpost pointing toward a path she thought she had left behind forever. She thought of her mother, of the stories, the training, the legacy of service that flowed through her veins. She thought of the calm that had settled over her during the crisis, the feeling of purpose, of competence, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was trained to do. The note and the coin were not just a recognition of her past. They were a challenge for her future. The quiet life she had tried to build for herself suddenly felt too small, too safe. The echo of her mother's legacy and the call of her own was growing too loud to ignore. The legend of the incident continued to grow, becoming a permanent part of the base's institutional memory. The table where General Vance had sat became known, unofficially at first, and then almost formally, as the Nightingale Table. New officers, fresh from their commissioning sources, were brought to the club by their senior mentors, who would sit them down at that very table and tell them the story. It became a required lesson in leadership, a parable about the difference between perceived authority and actual competence. The story served as a powerful inoculation against the kind of arrogance that had been Major Thorne's undoing. It reminded them that the person serving them coffee might have more combat experience than they did, that the janitor cleaning the floors might have forgotten more about leadership than they would ever learn, that true worth was not measured in rank or ribbons, but in character and skill. The story created a subtle but powerful shift, fostering a culture of mutual respect that extended beyond the uniform. It became a living piece of folklore, a constant, quiet reminder to look beyond the surface, to listen more than you speak, and to never, ever underestimate the quiet professional in the room. The passage of a year saw the seeds planted that night blossom into tangible legacies. The story of the Nightingale Table was no longer just gossip or a cautionary tale. It had become institutionalized, a formal part of the leadership curriculum for newly arrived officers at Fort Gower. It was a case study in humility, a powerful illustration that the most important lessons in command often come from the most unexpected sources. A new generation of lieutenants learned to see the civilian staff not as peripheral support, but as integral parts of the same team, many of them veterans or family members with their own stories of service and sacrifice. This newfound respect permeated the base, creating a healthier, more cohesive community. Major Thorne's journey of redemption continued. He became a mentor to many of those young officers, and his favorite teaching tool was his own spectacular failure. He would tell the story himself, not with shame, but with a raw, unflinching honesty. He used his own humiliation as a shield for others, teaching them the lesson he had learned so painfully. "I was a man who loved the sound of my own voice," he would say. "I valued the symbols of achievement more than the achievement itself. I assumed, and my assumption nearly cost a great man his life. Don't be me. Be her." His humility became his new source of strength, and in a profound twist of irony, he became a far more effective and respected leader as a humbled man than he ever was as an arrogant one. His career, which many thought was over, was saved by the very general he had failed. Vance, recognizing the profound change in the man, saw to it that Thorne's mistake became a mark of his growth, not a permanent stain on his record. For Alara, the year brought the most significant change of all. General Vance's note had been more than an invitation. It had been a catalyst. She left her job at the Officers' Club a few months after the incident, her departure as quiet and unassuming as her arrival. She enlisted, following the path her mother had forged, but on her own terms. With General Vance's personal recommendation opening doors, she was fast-tracked into the Army's most demanding medical training programs. She excelled. The calm, the focus, the innate competence that had saved the general were now honed and sharpened by the world's most advanced military medical education. She graduated at the top of her class, her name called out at a formal ceremony on a sun-drenched parade field. In the audience, seated amongst the proud families, was General Vance, now retired, a quiet civilian in a simple blazer. He watched as Alara, now in a crisp dress uniform, walked across the stage. She was no longer a waitress playing a role. She was a soldier who had found her true calling. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the crowd, a silent exchange of respect and gratitude. He had opened a door for her, and she had charged through it with everything she had. After the ceremony, he found her talking with her mother, a woman with a quiet strength and eyes that held the same steady calm as her daughter's. The medals on her uniform were real, a testament to a life of quiet heroism. The general simply shook her hand. "You raised a fine soldier," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her mother smiled. "She was always a soldier," she replied. She just needed to find her way back to the formation. Alara's first assignment was to a forward surgical team, the tip of the spear in combat medicine. She was home. The noise, the pressure, the high stakes, it was a world she had been born into, the language she understood. Her silence was now her asset, her calm, under pressure, a shield for those around her. She didn't speak of her legend. She didn't have to. She simply performed, her steady hands and quiet competence becoming their own form of folklore on a new continent, in a new conflict. The legacy of that night was not a single, static event. It was a living, breathing thing that continued to grow and evolve. It was present in the humility of a once arrogant major. It echoed in the halls of Fort Gower's leadership academies. It lived in the quiet, confident hands of a combat medic saving lives halfway across the world. It was a powerful testament to a simple, enduring truth, that a person's true value is not declared in loud words or displayed in polished medals, but is demonstrated in quiet actions when everything is on the line. It is the legacy of the quiet professional. The ripples of that single evening continue to spread, creating patterns of change that no one could have anticipated. Years later, Fort Gower was a different place. The story of Alara, Major Thorne, and General Vance had become more than just a teaching point. It had become a foundational myth, a part of the very identity of the post. The Nightingale table was now officially marked with a small, discreet brass plaque. It didn't recount the whole story, but simply read, "In honor of all quiet professionals." Competence is the only true rank. It became a tradition for newly promoted officers to have their first meal as a new rank at that table, a silent moment of reflection on the responsibilities of leadership and the virtue of humility. The plaque was a constant, silent sermon, more powerful than any lecture. It reminded everyone, from the highest-ranking commander to the newest private, that respect had to be earned, not just demanded, and that true strength was often found in the places you least expected it. The story had a life of its own, traveling with soldiers as they moved to new assignments around the globe. It was told in dusty tents in Afghanistan, in the galleys of naval ships in the Pacific, and in the sterile briefing rooms of the Pentagon. It became a piece of shared military culture, a shorthand for a specific kind of integrity. To call someone a nightingale became the highest of compliments, signifying not just skill, but a profound lack of ego, a commitment to service over self. It meant you were the person who ran toward the crisis while others were still figuring out what to do. It meant your actions spoke for you, freeing you from the need to speak for yourself. Alara's own career became the stuff of quiet legend. She served multiple combat tours, her skills as a medic becoming renowned within the special operations community. She earned her own collection of medals, including a Silver Star for actions that bore a striking resemblance to the ones General Vance had once described. She had crawled from a downed aircraft, under fire, to render aid to her crew and the soldiers they were carrying. She never spoke of her awards. They were simply a byproduct of the work, a quiet acknowledgement of a job done to the highest possible standard. She eventually became an instructor chosen to train the next generation of special operations medics. Her teaching style was famously minimalist. She spoke little, demonstrating techniques with a fluid precision that left her students in awe. Her greatest lesson was not in any manual. It was in her presence, her unwavering calm, her absolute focus. She taught her students that the most important tool in their medical kit was not a tourniquet or a chest tube, but a calm mind. She taught them that panic was a contagion, but so was competence. By being the calmest person in the room, they could become an anchor for everyone else in the chaos. General Vance lived to a ripe old age, and in his memoirs, he dedicated an entire chapter to that night at the officers' club. He wrote that in all his years of service, in all the battles he had witnessed, he had never seen a more perfect demonstration of courage and professionalism. He described Alara not as a waitress who had acted heroically, but as a hero who had happened to be working as a waitress. He argued that the nation's greatest strength was not in its advanced weaponry or its grand strategies, but in the hidden reservoirs of talent and character within its ordinary citizens, the quiet professionals who stood ready to act when the moment demanded it. His words immortalized the story, lifting it from military folklore into the national consciousness. It became a story about more than just the military. It became a story about the very character of the nation. It was a reminder that true greatness is not always loud, that true strength does not need to boast, and that the most important legacies are not those that are carved in stone, but those that are passed on through quiet, competent action from one generation to the next. The legacy of that night was not just about what happened, but about what continued to happen because of it. It was a legacy of change, of humility, and of a renewed appreciation for the silent, steady hands that hold the world together. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent strength defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.